This is Samson, my giant African bullfrog. He likes to relax in water, dig in the dirt, eat anything that moves, and more recently, act like a total menace, forcing me to make a completely new and much larger 6-foot paludarium, which is almost as long as I am tall because the other could no longer contain him, and that's not because he outgrew it. Now when I say he's large, it's not hyperbole. He's literally a giant among frogs, and will likely grow to around 10 inches long. He's currently 8 inches from here to rear, weighing in at a whopping 33 ounces. But don't let his rotund appearance fool you, he's built different. ABFs are just as agile as any other species and made for battle. In the wild, the large males clash for breeding rights, and the competition is fierce. In other words, they're as indestructible as a frog could possibly be, which is precisely why Samson simultaneously created a major problem and survived a potentially life-threatening scenario. Allow me to explain. Last year I remade his entire home because the aquarium leaked. The revision looked great and included features I thought would improve his quality of life, including a dripping branch overhang to support plants and provide refuge within the water feature. However, this ended up being a terrible decision. What was intended to, and initially appeared to be a place of tranquility, must have become an annoyance. He decided to exit the building. I was disturbed to find him sitting on the floor one day, but thankfully he wasn't injured from such a fall. This all happened shortly after the build. I dampened the drips and added clamps to prevent it from happening again, and everything seemed fine until recently when I did a water change. I must not have properly dialed the drips, and apparently the clamps couldn't contain him this whole time because I found him on the floor once again. Luckily he's been calm since, but I can't take any more chances because next time he might not be so lucky. There won't be a next time though. That's because I decided to build him a new home already for a completely different reason. He's almost too big to fit through this gap, which isn't ideal for him or me. The solution was simple: create a front opening enclosure to eliminate this issue for good. Luckily, it had already been in the works for months, but his recent antics motivated me to finish it sooner than later. From the start, my plan was to make something within the same footprint as a standard 125-gallon long aquarium. He currently lives in a 75-gallon, which is actually the same width. He moves in this space well, but I knew that having extra length and height would allow for better versions of the features he already enjoys. Well, all the features except for the drip overhang and a removable lid. Naturally, they don't make tanks like this, so I took matters into my own hands and built one myself. I got 1/2 inch thick glass rough cut at a local glazer and had to do some prep work before assembling the pieces. It's rare that I add frames to these custom tanks, but I felt it was best for this one because of how he broke through the lid. I'd have to add screens again, and with the front opening system, I could just attach them directly to the frame. Having tamper-proof filtration with these large frogs is a must, so I always drill for bulkheads to avoid any mischief. I wouldn't add the glass tracks or lid till much later. With the canvas set, my goal now was to create a landscape reminiscent of the African bullfrog's native range in southern Africa. When they're not hibernating in the dry season, they often reside near ephemeral water holes similar to this. With this in mind, I'd say his previous setups were designed well around his needs, but they were far from an accurate representation of where he'd actually live. Part of that, and what I've done before, is provide a land area large enough for burrowing. With this new footprint, I had the opportunity to make features like that much larger. To make it, I'd need some glass, and where better to obtain it than a retired paludarium. Salvaging materials like this is more work, but it helps keep costs down and is a great way to repurpose things. However, just getting glass wasn't enough. The front was already the right size, so I used it as a guide to adjust the height of the others. When recombined later, these panes will create a land area of roughly 12 gallons. Before that, I had work to do on the background, which will utilize new techniques. That said, it began like many others. I used the tank's measurements to cut down sheets of XPS foam for a base layer. Of course, I also accounted for the bulkheads. Creating side panels is more work, but they help these projects appear far more immersive, so I had to do that here. The foam didn't require much silicone either. A few dabs were more than enough to lock them in. Adding the land feature was simple too. I adhered bumpers to the edges and assembled it like any other aquarium. The silicone had to cure before I could do a water test. I've had issues with Sam's land area leaking in the past, so this was an essential step. Catching leaks early is always best, and luckily that wasn't an issue here. The background required more structure before I could continue, and the beauty of this technique is that it can be made largely with scraps, which I always keep. Creating a gradual transition into the land area would help facilitate the appearance of a watering hole and make the setup functional for Sam. Simply making the rough shape of stairs would be sufficient for this particular setup, with no additional carving necessary. All of these had to be secured to the glass and each other as well. Although Sam hated the dripping feature, he does appreciate a good overhang. I built up more foam to provide one. After all, this is something that would naturally exist at a watering hole, and the plan was to make it look similar to this. I could have continued building the structure with foam scraps, but I knew expanding foam would speed up the process, and it did. I will admit that I got a little overzealous with it and had to carve off some excess. This rough-looking foundation is exactly that, a foundation. It serves no aesthetic function, and is there simply to fill void space so the enclosure remains as light as possible. Taping over the frame and bulkheads is an easy way to preserve features that must remain unaltered. I don't know about you, but I'm absolutely tired of carving foam, and I realize I just used it, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm referring to pretty much every way that I've used it in the past. For being honest, it's a very wasteful process, and the results end up being lackluster. You spend hours carving something which looks great, until you add grout, paint, or some combination of the two. The details end up getting muddied, resulting in an artificial look. I've been using techniques like these for decades, and although they've served me well till now, I'd like to largely retire them moving forward. I was really inspired about a year ago whenever I was watching Reels, and I saw some random guy carving a faux rock panel. It wasn't for animals, but I knew it was a potential solution to the foaming process I've become disenfranchised with. Since then, I've been doing research and experimenting in my spare time with grouts, concretes, and other materials to find an ideal solution. The primary issue with concrete is its weight. As you can imagine, it's quite heavy, and whenever you're making a giant background in these big setups, some of which I haven't shown you yet, it's going to get really heavy, and so it's not going to fly if we're just using standard concrete. Now there are ways to make it lighter, which I explored, but none of those solutions seemed viable. As I explored my options and did research, I came across this incredible product, the Buddy Rhodes Vertical Concrete Mix. This is literally what is being used to create large zoo displays both in and around enclosures. It's non-toxic, eco-friendly, lightweight, strong, carvable, and fairly inexpensive. I'll give a full cost breakdown later on, but as you can imagine, whenever I discovered this, I was extremely excited. For it to work as intended, it must be mixed with ramp primer and water. I measured each and combined them in a bucket. This concrete is also easy to color with pigments, and since I'm attempting to replicate dirt, a light brown seemed like the obvious choice. I mixed this into the liquids before blending in the concrete. For proper adhesion to the foam, a mix of 50-50 ramp and water had to be sprayed on. Once tacky, I simply slapped the concrete in place. It honestly was a lot of fun, and took me back to playing with mud when I was young. Anyway, as I covered the foam and built the structure, I considered the environment I wished to recreate, and how I'd carve it out to achieve that appearance, knowing that most of this would be removed. I let it firm up for about 15 minutes before carving. It was still wet, but kind of crumbly. Such a consistency made it extremely easy to create the look of a muddy embankment. I gotta say that carving this is way easier than foam, and the texture is pretty believable. However, as with other projects, the finer details pull a lot of weight. I embedded a few small roots and rocks in the overhang, which helped significantly. All of this carving resulted in a lot of scraps, which unlike foam can be reused while they're still wet. I just mixed in some more water, and it was enough to fill the rest of the scape. What little remained I pressed into the roots for added effect. With only one bag, the appearance was strong. However, I felt the right side was a little flat, so I mixed up a second bag to add further definition. I figured driftwood could help with that as well. Once cured, the structure itself was dynamic, but now the color appeared flat. Luckily, concrete glazes can address that, but not in the same way as paint. They'll stain and recolor the surface without removing any detail. Umber accents over the entirety of the sculpture helped it appear warmer. A feature you'll notice with watering holes is that the mud is always darker around the water. I mixed up black and umber and diluted it with water to replicate this. I later scuffed the surface with a wire brush to add highlights. Some cleanup work was required as well, but that's to be expected. I was glad to see the scape come together, but the enclosure wasn't complete. Reaching through the top of Sam's current tank isn't just an issue because of his size. It's also kinda sketchy because of poor access. All I'll say is that I've been bitten by him twice because of it, and it's no fun. While taking a step back to review everything, I couldn't help but feel like something was missing. The branch on the right looked out of place, but I couldn't undo it. I combined it with other pieces to mimic the appearance of a stump in eroding soil. I took as many liberties as possible with the scape, and it turned out well despite not being as detailed as I'd prefer. With Sam, there's a fine line between form and function. Inevitably, the details have to be an afterthought because he has to be able to traverse through the space without destroying it. Anyway, I like to clean these backgrounds before adding the finishing touches so nothing from construction remains. It seems that the plant these frogs encounter most in the wild is grass, so that's what I wanted for this build. I've tried going bioactive with him before, but it's pointless. Because of his size and habits, it inevitably gets gross and needs to be replaced. Instead, I just use plain old coconut fiber. I want the grass in this area, but they do better with a different substrate. To get around this, I mixed up a different blend and placed them in permeable plant bags. This gave me the best of both worlds. The substrate can be easily replaced with minimal disruption to the plants. I may add more later, but for now, less is more. He needs adequate room to dig and crawl around. Unfortunately, the cocoa fiber and sand kind of exposed the fact that I didn't make the concrete brown enough. I suppose some mistakes should have been expected though, because this was my first time trying this in a full-blown build. Here's a quick breakdown of how much it cost me to make this background, excluding tools, tax, and shipping. Keep in mind that I made my background largely out of scrap materials. I put the rough cost of foam in here just to get a better calculation. I'll admit that it may not be the cheapest method around, but all things considered with these results, I'd say it's well worth it. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I felt this would appear best with tannins in the water. I don't know what's going on, but all of a sudden, the big man's not looking so big anymore. With the right care, African bullfrogs can live for well over 30 years. So it's very possible I'll still have him by the time my kids go to college, and I don't even have kids yet. In fact, most of the animals you see me work with are pretty long-lived, which is part of the reason why I constantly reiterate their setups, even if it's in response to something unplanned like a leak or escape. Sometimes there's failure, and I suppose that's life in general. We fail, and our growth is determined by how we react and adapt to such scenarios. I assumed the drip would be a nice tranquil feature he'd enjoy, but my judgment was off and it had a negative effect. I did bandage the situation for a while, but band-aids don't last forever, and he was happy to remind me of that. I'm glad he did. Samson truly looks at home.